The Galactic Council's emergency session had been called for the third time this cycle, and Captain Sarah Chen knew exactly why. The Krillian Empire was expanding again, swallowing entire star systems like a cosmic plague. She stood in the observation deck of the human diplomatic vessel Harmony's Edge, watching the massive space station that housed the Council's headquarters rotate slowly against the backdrop of distant stars. "Captain, we're receiving the docking clearance now," announced Lieutenant Torres from the bridge. Sarah nodded, though her mind was elsewhere. Humanity had only been part of the Galactic Council for 12 standard years, making them one of the newest members among the 43 species represented. They were also, by most accounts, considered the weakest. The Harmony's Edge was not an impressive vessel by galactic standards. Where other species boasted ships kilometers long with weapons that could crack planets, humanity's flagship was a modest cruiser barely 800 meters from bow to stern. Its hull bore the scars of recent skirmishes, patched with different alloys that gave it a patchwork appearance. To most alien observers, it looked like a ship held together by hope and desperation. Sarah made her way to the shuttle bay, where Ambassador Elena Vasquez was already waiting with her diplomatic team. Elena was in her 50s, with silver-streaked hair and eyes that had seen too much of the galaxy's cruelty. She had been humanity's voice in the Council since first contact, and Sarah respected her more than any other person alive. "Ready for another round of being ignored?" Elena asked with a wry smile as they boarded the diplomatic shuttle. "Always," Sarah replied, "though I have to admit I'm curious about these Krillian warriors everyone's so terrified of." Elena's expression darkened. "Trust me, Sarah, you don't want to meet them in person, the reports from the outer colonies," she shuddered. "They don't just conquer worlds, they break them, break the people on them." The shuttle journey to the Council station took 20 minutes, during which Sarah reviewed the latest intelligence reports. The Krillian Empire had emerged from the Galactic Rim 3 years ago, a spacefaring civilization that had apparently spent centuries perfecting the art of warfare. Their ships were biological in nature, grown rather than built, and their warriors were said to be physically and mentally engineered for combat. What made them truly terrifying, according to the reports, was not just their military might but their psychological warfare. They would arrive at a system, broadcast recordings of what they had done to previous colonies, and often the defenders would surrender without a fight. Those who resisted faced total annihilation. No prisoners were taken. No mercy was shown. The Council station's docking bay was a marvel of engineering, capable of accommodating ships from dozens of different species, with varying atmospheric and gravitational requirements. Sarah had been here many times, but she still felt a moment of vertigo as they passed through the transition field that adjusted their local gravity and atmosphere to the station's standard. The Council chamber itself was a massive amphitheater with seating arranged in concentric circles, based on each species' influence and military power. Humanity's seats were in the outer ring, naturally, alongside other minor powers like the peaceful Delari traders and the aquatic Tethians who rarely left their water-filled sections of the galaxy. At the center of the chamber, in the most prestigious positions, sat the major powers. The Valorian Republic held the prime position, their representatives tall and elegant with their crystalline skin that refracted light in mesmerizing patterns. The Valorians had been the Council's military backbone for over a century, their fleets the first line of defense against threats like the Krillians. To their right sat the hegemony of Zeph, insected beings whose technological prowess was legendary. Their ships were marvels of engineering, capable of feats that seemed to defy physics. The Morvac Confederacy occupied the left position, a collection of warrior clans whose individual members could tear through steel with their bare claws. Sarah took her place beside Elena and the other human representatives, nodding the way conversations stopped as they passed. Humanity's reputation in the Council was complicated. They were seen as resourceful and surprisingly adaptable, but also primitive and crude. Their technology was considered laughably outdated, their ships barely capable of faster-than-light travel. What puzzled many Council members was humanity's apparent inability to be properly conquered or eliminated. Every time a threat emerged that should have wiped them out, they somehow survived through what other species could only describe as impossible stubbornness, combined with tactical creativity that bordered on insanity. The session began with High Counselor Thane, a Valorian whose crystalline form caught the chamber's lights and threw rainbow patterns across the walls. His voice resonated with harmonic overtones that made translation devices struggle to keep up. Honored representatives, we face a crisis unlike any in recent memory. The Krillian expansion has accelerated beyond all projections. In the last standard month alone, they have claimed 7 star systems, including the heavily fortified Xerian defense grid. Murmurs of concern rippled through the chamber. The Xerian grid had been considered impregnable, a maze of orbital fortresses and automated defense platforms that had deterred aggression for decades. Counselor Thane continued, "Intelligence reports indicate the Krillians accomplished this not through superior firepower, though they possess that in abundance, but through psychological warfare. The Xerian defenders surrendered after receiving transmission that detailed the fate of the Kepler colonies." Sarah had read about Kepler. An entire system of 12 billion inhabitants had simply disappeared. No distress calls, no desperate last transmissions. One day they were there, the next, nothing but empty worlds and dead space stations. "The question before us," Thane said, "is how to respond. Military advisors from all major powers have concluded that a direct confrontation would result in catastrophic losses, possibly the destruction of our combined fleets." General Vrak of the Morvac Confederacy stood, his massive form bristling with what Sarah had learned to recognize as barely controlled aggression. The Morvac were natural predators, standing 3 meters tall with armored carapaces and claws that could slice through battle armor. Their voices carried a subsonic rumble that human ears couldn't properly detect but could certainly feel. "Honored Council, the Morvac have never retreated from any enemy, but the Krillians—" He paused, and Sarah caught something in his translation that made her heart skip. Fear. This creature that looked like it could tear apart a tank with its bare hands was afraid. "The Krillians do not fight with honor," Vrak continued. "They do not seek victory through strength or courage. They corrupt the mind before they engage the body. Our scouts who have encountered them report that the Krillian warriors emit some form of psychic presence that induces terror in their enemies. Even our most seasoned fighters become paralyzed with fear in their presence." Technarch Zeeks of the hegemony of Zeph clicked and chirped, their insected limbs moving in precise gestures that accompanied their translated words. "Our analysis confirms General Vrak's assessment. The Krillian bioships appear to be grown specifically to maximize psychological impact. Their very appearance triggers fear responses in most known species. Combined with documented evidence of their combat effectiveness, resistance appears inadvisable." Sarah found herself leaning forward. The 3 most powerful military forces in known space were essentially admitting they were too scared to fight. She glanced at Alina, who was taking notes with the focused intensity of someone recording what might be humanity's death sentence. The debate continued for hours, with various representatives proposing strategies that ranged from desperate to delusional. Evacuation plans, negotiation attempts, even suggestions to simply abandon the threatened sectors and hope the Krillians would stop expanding. Finally, High Counselor Thane called for formal proposals. "Each member species may present their recommended course of action. We will begin with our primary military powers and proceed accordingly." The Valorian proposal was, essentially, strategic withdrawal. Pull back all forces to core systems and hope the Krillians would be satisfied with the outer territories. The Zeph proposed a massive technological initiative to develop new weapons that might prove effective. The Morvac suggested hiding and waiting for the Krillians to destroy themselves through internal conflict. When it came time for the minor powers to speak, most simply endorsed one of the major proposals. The Delari voted for negotiation, the Tethians for evacuation, others for various forms of strategic retreat. Finally, Thane's attention turned to the human section. "Ambassador Vasquez, does humanity wish to present a proposal?" Elena stood slowly, and Sarah could see the weight of the decision on her shoulders. What could humanity possibly offer that the major powers hadn't already considered? "High Counselor, honored representatives," Elena began, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustics. "Humanity appreciates the gravity of the situation and the careful consideration given by all our allies. However, we would like to propose an alternative approach." The chamber fell silent. Sarah could sense the attention of hundreds of alien minds focused on Alina's words. "We propose direct diplomatic contact with the Krillian Empire." The silence stretched for several heartbeats before erupting into chaos. Representatives from a dozen species began speaking at once, their translation devices creating a cacophony of protests and disbelief. General Vrak's subsonic growl cut through the noise. Madness. The Krillians do not negotiate. They conquer or they destroy. There is no middle ground. Elena waited for the commotion to die down before continuing. With respect, General, that assumption is based on limited data. Every contact with the Krillians so far has been military in nature. They have never been approached by a neutral diplomatic party without aggressive intent. Technarch Zeke's clicked rapidly, their agitation obvious even through the translation. Neutral. Humanity is part of this council. They will see you as enemies by association. Perhaps, Elena acknowledged, but humanity offers something unique in this situation. We are the newest council members, with the smallest military presence and the least to gain from the current power structure. From the Krillian perspective, we represent minimal threat. High Counselor Thane's crystalline form shifted, light patterns swirling through his translucent body in what Sarah had learned indicated deep thought. Ambassador Vasquez, even assuming the Krillians would agree to such contact, what makes humanity believe they can succeed where others fear to try? Elena smiled, and Sarah recognized the expression. It was the same smile Elena wore when she was about to make a point that would surprise everyone in the room. Because, honored counselor, humanity has a unique perspective on fear. We have spent our entire evolutionary history as prey animals who learn to hunt predators. We understand that the most dangerous creatures often have the deepest vulnerabilities. The chamber erupted again, but this time the tone was different. There was skepticism, certainly, but also a desperate hope. The major powers had essentially admitted they had no viable military solution. Humanity's proposal might be insane, but it was something other than surrender. General Vrak leaned forward, his massive form casting a shadow across several rows of seating. And if you fail, if the Krillians simply destroy your ship and continue their expansion, then we will have lost one diplomatic vessel and gained valuable intelligence about Krillian intentions and capabilities, Elena replied calmly. The risk to humanity is minimal compared to the potential benefit to the Council as a whole. Sarah admired Elena's diplomatic language, though she knew the truth was more complex. Humanity couldn't afford to lose any ships, let alone their primary diplomatic vessel. But Elena was right about one thing: they had less to lose than anyone else in the chamber. The debate that followed was intense but brief. The major powers were clearly uncomfortable with the idea, but they also couldn't offer any better alternatives. In the end, the vote was closer than Sarah had expected. 22 species in favor, 18 opposed, with 3 abstentions. As the session concluded and representatives began filing out, Sarah noticed something interesting. The species that had voted in favor were primarily the smaller powers, those who, like humanity, occupied the outer rings of the chamber. The major powers had voted against, but without the passionate opposition Sarah had expected. They want us to try, she realized aloud as she and Elena walked back toward the docking bay. Of course they do, Elena replied. If we succeed, they look wise for supporting us. If we fail, they haven't risked anything significant and they can proceed with their contingency plans. And what do you think our actual chances are? Elena paused at the shuttle airlock, looking back toward the council chamber. Honestly, I think we're about to attempt something that every species in that chamber believes is impossible, which, given humanity's track record, means we might just pull it off. As their shuttle departed the council station, Sarah found herself staring out at the stars and wondering what they were about to face. The Krillians were described as the most feared warriors in the galaxy, creatures so terrifying that even the sight of them could paralyze experienced soldiers. But Elena was right about humanity's unique perspective. They had spent millennia learning that the most fearsome predators often had unexpected weaknesses. Lions feared bees, elephants feared mice. Perhaps even galactic conquerors had something they feared in return. The question was whether humanity could figure out what that might be before it was too late for everyone. 3 days later, the Harmony's Edge received new orders. They were to proceed to the edge of Krillian space and attempt to establish communication. No council ships would accompany them. No backup would be available. They would be entirely on their own, representing not just humanity but the hope of 43 species that had run out of other options. As Sarah stood on the bridge watching the stars shift into the familiar patterns of faster-than-light travel, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were heading towards something that would change everything. Whether for better or worse remained to be seen. The Krillians were waiting somewhere in the darkness ahead, and soon humanity would discover what it truly meant to face the galaxy's most feared warriors. The journey to the edge of Krillian space took 8 days through hyperspace, during which the crew of the Harmony's Edge prepared for what might be humanity's first and last diplomatic contact with the galaxy's most feared empire. Captain Sarah Chen spent most of those days in the ship's cramped research lab with Dr. James Ockafer, the mission's xenobiologist, poring over every scrap of intelligence they had about the Krillians. "The problem," Dr. Ockafer explained as he projected holographic displays of blurry reconnaissance photos, "is that most of our information comes from survivors who were, by all accounts, terrified out of their minds when they encountered Krillian forces." The images showed massive, organic-looking ships that seemed to breathe and pulse with an inner light. Their hulls were covered in what looked like scales or chitinous plates, and they moved through space with an undulating motion that was distinctly unsettling to watch. Witness accounts describe the Krillian warriors themselves as approximately humanoid but significantly larger, possibly 3 to 4 meters in height. They appear to be covered in natural armor plating, with multiple limbs and sensory organs. Most witnesses describe feeling overwhelming terror before they could observe more specific details. Sarah studied the fragmentary data with growing frustration. So we're essentially flying blind into a meeting with beings whose primary effect on other species is to scare them senseless. "That appears to be the situation, yes," Dr. Ockafer confirmed. "However, I've been analyzing the biological markers from the encounters, and I think there might be more to it than simple psychological intimidation." He pulled up a new display showing brain scan data from survivors. "Look at these neural activity patterns. The fear response isn't just emotional, it's physiological. Something about Krillian presence triggers a deep, instinctive terror reaction in most species. It's almost like they're designed to be terrifying." "But why would evolution or engineering produce that effect?" Sarah asked. "That's the interesting question," Dr. Ockafer said, his eyes lighting up with scientific curiosity. "Most predator species develop features that help them hunt specific prey, but this level of fear induction suggests something different. It's almost like." "Like what?" "Like they're afraid of something themselves, and have developed this as a defense mechanism." The thought was intriguing, but Sarah put it aside as they approached their destination. The edge of Krillian space was marked not by any official boundary, but by the simple absence of any response to communications. Ships that entered this region either turned back immediately or were never heard from again. Lieutenant Torres announced their arrival at the designated coordinates from the bridge. "Captain, we're dropping out of hyperspace in 30 seconds, all systems showing green." Sarah made her way to the bridge, where Ambassador Vasquez was already waiting. Elena looked calm, but Sarah could see the tension in her posture. They were about to attempt something that every military expert in the galaxy had declared suicide. The Harmony's Edge shuddered slightly as it transitioned back to normal space, and the main view screen showed the familiar star patterns of the galactic rim. But there was something wrong with the picture. Several of the stars that should have been visible were blocked out by massive shapes moving slowly against the cosmic backdrop. "Jesus," whispered Ensign Park from the sensor station. "Captain, I'm reading 12. No, 16 large objects in our immediate vicinity. They're surrounding us." Sarah felt her heart rate spike but kept her voice steady. "Can you identify them?" "Biological signatures, ma'am. Definitely Krillian vessels. And they're huge." The main screen automatically adjusted its zoom and focus, and suddenly the crew of the Harmony's Edge got their first clear look at a Krillian ship. It was easily 2 kilometers long, its hull covered in overlapping scales that shifted and rippled with an organic rhythm. Spines and tentacle-like appendages protruded from various points along its length, some of which appeared to be moving independently of the ship's motion. "It looks like it's alive," Elena murmured. "According to our intelligence, it probably is," Sarah replied. "Dr. Ockafer thinks their ships are grown rather than built." More ships became visible as the sensors adjusted to the local conditions. The human vessel was completely surrounded, trapped in the middle of what was clearly a battle formation designed to prevent any chance of escape. "Captain," Torres reported, his voice tight with controlled fear, "we're receiving a transmission. It's in our language." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. The Krillians had never been known to communicate with their victims before attacking. The fact that they were using human language suggested they had been monitoring Earth's transmissions for some time. "Put it through," Sarah ordered. The main screen flickered and was replaced by something that made several crew members gasp audibly. The being looking back at them was indeed humanoid in basic structure, but any similarity to human anatomy ended there. It stood nearly 4 meters tall, with 4 arms ending in clawed hands and a torso covered in what appeared to be natural armor plating. Its head was elongated and featured multiple eyes arranged in a pattern that hurt to look at directly. But it was the creature's presence rather than its appearance that hit the human crew like a physical blow. Every instinct Sarah had developed over 20 years in space told her to run, hide, or surrender immediately. The rational part of her mind recognized that she was experiencing the fear effect other species had described, but knowing that didn't make it any easier to resist. The being spoke, its voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in the ship's hull itself. "Small creatures from Sol, we know your species, we know your weakness, we know why you have come." Sarah forced herself to step forward, fighting against every instinct that told her to move away from the screen. "I am Captain Sarah Chen of the human diplomatic vessel *Harmonies, Edge *. I request permission to speak with a representative of the Krillian Empire regarding the current territorial expansion in this sector." The being's multiple eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel like an insect under a microscope. "You speak of diplomacy, you speak of territories. These concepts have no meaning. There is only strength and weakness, hunter and prey. You are prey." Elena stepped up beside Sarah, and the captain was impressed by her ambassador's ability to maintain composure under the alien's intimidating presence. "We represent 43 species of the Galactic Council. We come seeking understanding, not conflict." 43 species of prey," the being corrected, its harmonics shifting in what might have been amusement. "They send the weakest among them because they fear to come themselves. They believe we will show mercy to small creatures who pose no threat." Sarah felt a spark of anger cut through her fear. "And will you?" The being leaned forward, filling more of the screen, and the fear effect intensified. "Why would hunters show mercy to prey? Why would the strong spare the weak? This is not the way of existence." "Because," Sarah said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice, "sometimes the strongest hunters know the difference between a threat and a distraction. You've conquered 7 star systems in the past month. You could have conquered 70 if that was truly your goal. But you didn't, which suggests there's something else you want." For the first time since the communication began, the being was silent. Its multiple eyes seemed to shift focus, studying Sarah with new intensity. "You seek to understand hunters by thinking like prey," it finally said. "This is impossible. Prey creatures cannot comprehend the needs of true predators." Ambassador Vasquez seized the opening. "Then help us comprehend. What is it that true predators need? What is it that hunters seek when they've already proven their dominance?" The being's response was immediate and surprising. "Safety." The single word hung in the air like a revelation. Sarah exchanged glances with Elena, both of them recognizing the significance of what they had just heard. "Safety from what?" Sarah asked carefully. The being's demeanor changed subtly, the intimidating presence shifting to something that might have been uncertainty. "From that which hunts hunters, from that which makes even the strong weak, from that which comes from the deep dark between stars." Dr. Okafor had been right. The Krillians were afraid of something. "What comes from the deep dark?" Elena asked gently. The being's eyes closed for a moment, and when they reopened, Sarah could have sworn she saw something like pain in their alien depths. "They have no name that translates to prey languages. They are the hunger that cannot be satisfied, the darkness that consumes light. They follow our expansion path. They feed on what we leave behind." Sarah felt the pieces clicking into place. "You're not expanding because you want more territory. You're running from something." "We do not run," the being snarled, its intimidating presence returning full force. "We are Krillian. We are the apex hunters of 1,000 worlds. We do not flee from any enemy." "But you're moving in a specific direction," Sarah pressed. "Away from something in the galactic rim, something that scares you more than you scare other species." The communication channel fell silent for so long that Sarah began to wonder if the connection had been cut. When the being finally spoke again, its voice carried new harmonics that the translation system struggled to interpret. 3 cycles ago, our rim colonies reported contact with unknown entities. These entities demonstrated capabilities that defied understanding. They consumed entire worlds, not conquered, consumed. The matter itself was broken down and absorbed. Elena leaned forward. What happened to the colonies? Gone, not destroyed, unmade. As if they had never existed, we sent our greatest hunters to investigate. They did not return. We sent entire fleets. They were consumed like the colonies. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ship's environmental systems. How many worlds did you lose? 47 colonies, 12 fortress worlds, 4 primary breeding centers. The being paused, and Sarah realized with shock that what she was hearing in its voice was grief. 2 billion of our people, gone without trace or memory. The implications were staggering. If the Krillians, with all their apparent military might and fear-inducing presence, were fleeing from something even worse, then the galaxy faced a threat that made the current expansion look like a minor territorial dispute. Why didn't you warn the Council? Elena asked. Why not ask for help? The being's laugh was a sound like grinding metal. Pray for help against super predators. Ask the weak to stand against that which defeated the strong. This would be madness. But you're warning us now, Sarah pointed out. We warn no one. We state facts to doomed creatures who will not survive to use such knowledge. Sarah felt her anger flare again. You're going to kill us rather than risk the possibility that we might help. We kill you because it is efficient. Your deaths serve multiple purposes. They eliminate potential witnesses to our flight. They provide biomass for our ships. They demonstrate to other prey species that resistance is futile. Elena stepped forward, and Sarah was amazed to see that the ambassador was actually smiling. That's where you're wrong, though. Explain impossibility. You said we're prey species, and you're probably right about most of us. But you've made an assumption about humanity that could cost you everything. The being's eyes focused intently on Elena. State assumption. You assume that because we're weaker than you, we can't help you. But consider this. We've survived for thousands of years on a world filled with predators stronger, faster, and more dangerous than us. We're still here. They're not. Sarah saw where Elena was going with this, and felt a surge of admiration for the ambassador's tactical thinking. Elena continued, You're stronger than us, yes, but you're also predictable. You rely on fear and intimidation because that's what's always worked. But what happens when you face something that doesn't fear you? Something that's immune to intimidation, something that thinks of you the same way you think of us. The being was silent, but Sarah could see its attention was completely focused on Elena's words. Humanity has experienced fighting enemies we couldn't overpower directly. We've learned to be creative, adaptive, unpredictable. We've learned to find weaknesses in creatures that seemed invincible. And most importantly, we've learned that sometimes the best way to defeat a superior enemy is to convince them they don't want to fight you in the first place. You speak in riddles. Elena's smile widened. I'm offering you something no other species can, a partnership with creatures who understand how to be prey that fights back, who know how to turn weakness into strength and disadvantage into opportunity. Sarah held her breath, waiting for the alien's response. The fear effect was still present, but somehow it seemed less overwhelming now. Perhaps she was adapting to it, or perhaps the being's emotional state was affecting its ability to project intimidation. You believe small prey creatures can stand against entities that consumed the greatest hunters in the galaxy. I believe, Elena said firmly, that if those entities are half as dangerous as you claim, then you're going to need every ally you can get. And humanity specializes in being the ally nobody expects to matter until the moment we do. The communication channel went silent again, but this time Sarah could sense activity on the other end. The being seemed to be consulting with others outside the transmission range. When it returned, its entire demeanor had changed. The intimidating presence was still there, but it was tempered by something Sarah couldn't quite identify. Respect, perhaps, or at least serious consideration. Small Captain Sarah Chen, Small Ambassador Relina Vasquez, we will grant temporary cessation of hostilities to discuss this impossibility you propose. Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. You'll negotiate. We will listen to specific proposals. If these proposals demonstrate practical value, we will consider alliance with prey species against greater threat. Alina stepped forward. We'll need to bring representatives from the other council species. This affects everyone. Negative, we will speak only with humans. Other prey species lack sufficient courage to be useful. You will return to your council and present our terms. What terms? Sarah asked. Cessation of expansion in exchange for mutual defense pact. We provide military strength. You provide tactical innovation. Together we face the darkness that comes behind us. The screen flickered and went dark, leaving the crew of the Asterisk Harmony's Edge staring at their own reflection. Around them, the massive Krillian ships began moving away, their organic hulls undulating as they disappeared back into the darkness of space. Well, Alina said after a long moment, that went better than expected. Sarah realized she was shaking, adrenaline finally catching up with her now that the immediate danger had passed. Alina, what the hell did we just agree to? We agreed to save the galaxy from something even worse than the Krillians, Alina replied calmly. And we agreed to do it by convincing 43 species to ally themselves with their worst nightmares. Sarah sank into her captain's chair, suddenly feeling the weight of what they had just accomplished. They had made contact with the galaxy's most feared warriors and somehow convinced them to consider peace. But in doing so, they had learned of a threat that made the Krillian expansion look like a minor inconvenience. Set course for the council station, she ordered, and send a priority message ahead. Tell them we need an emergency session. Tell them humanity has a proposal that's going to change everything. As the Asterisk Harmony's Edge jumped back into hyperspace, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they had just set events in motion that would determine the fate of every living being in the galaxy. The question was whether they had just saved civilization or doomed it to an even worse fate than Krillian conquest. The darkness between the stars, suddenly, seemed a lot more threatening than it had before. The emergency session of the Galactic Council was unlike anything in the organization's 3-century history. Representatives who had barely spoken to each other in decades were huddled in urgent conversations, while the chamber's translation systems worked overtime to keep up with the dozens of languages being spoken simultaneously. Captain Sarah Chen stood beside Ambassador Vasquez at the central presentation podium, acutely aware that every eye in the chamber was focused on them. The holographic display above their heads showed the intelligence data they had gathered from their encounter with the Krillians, including long-range sensor readings of the massive fleet that had surrounded their ship. High Counselor Thane's crystalline form pulsed with agitated light patterns as he called for order. Representatives, please. Ambassador Vasquez has requested this emergency session to present findings from humanity's diplomatic mission. Given the unprecedented nature of these findings, I urge everyone to listen carefully before responding. Alina stepped forward, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustics. Honored Council, humanity's mission to establish contact with the Krillian Empire was successful. We have confirmed that the Krillians are willing to negotiate a cessation of their expansion in exchange for a mutual defense pact with the Council. The chamber erupted in a mixture of relief and disbelief. General Vrak of the Morvac Confederacy rose from his seat, his massive form bristling with skepticism. Impossible. The Krillians do not negotiate. They conquer or destroy. What deception is this? No deception, General, Alina replied calmly. The Krillians agreed to negotiations because they face a threat even greater than their own military capabilities. They are not expanding by choice. They are fleeing from something. Technarch Zeeks of the hegemony of Zeph clicked rapidly, their agitation obvious. Fleeing from what? What could threaten beings that induce terror in all who encounter them? Sarah activated the holographic display, showing the data they had compiled from their conversation with the Krillian representative. According to our contact, approximately 3 standard years ago, Krillian colonies in the Galactic Rim began reporting contact with unknown entities. These entities demonstrated the ability to completely consume matter at the molecular level, not just destroying worlds, but unmaking them entirely. The silence that followed was profound. Even the chamber's environmental system seemed to quiet as the implications sank in. Alina continued. The Krillians lost 47 colonies, 12 fortress worlds, and over 2 billion inhabitants before they began their strategic withdrawal. They sent their most powerful fleets to investigate, and those fleets were consumed without a trace. Counselor Murrath of the Delari Confederation, a species known for their peaceful trading practices, spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. If the Krillians cannot stand against these entities, what hope do we have? That, Alina said, is exactly the question we need to answer. But first, we need to understand what we're facing. Sarah stepped forward to take control of the presentation. Based on the information provided by the Krillians, these entities, which they refer to as the hunger that cannot be satisfied, appear to operate unlike any known form of life. They don't conquer territory for resources or strategic advantage. They consume it completely, breaking down matter at the fundamental level and absorbing it into themselves. The display showed a three-dimensional map of the galactic rim, with red zones marking the areas where Krillian colonies had been lost. The pattern was disturbingly methodical, advancing in a sweeping arc that would eventually encompass most of the galaxy's inhabited regions. The advancement pattern suggests intelligence and purpose, Sarah continued. They're not randomly consuming matter, they're following specific paths, almost like they're herding the Krillians toward the galactic core, toward us. General Vrak stood again, his subsonic growl making several representatives shift uncomfortably in their seats. You speak of entities we have never seen, based on the word of our enemies. Why should we trust Krillian claims? Perhaps this is elaborate deception designed to make us lower our defenses. Alina had been expecting this objection. Because, General, the Krillians gain nothing from such a deception. They were in the process of conquering our territories when they encountered these entities. If they wanted to continue their expansion, they would simply have done so. They have demonstrated superior military capabilities. They don't need elaborate psychological warfare when direct force has proven effective. Counselor Thane's form shifted, light patterns indicating deep consideration. Assuming these claims are accurate, what specific proposal do the Krillians offer? Complete cessation of territorial expansion in exchange for a mutual defense pact, Alina replied. They provide military strength and technological resources. We provide tactical innovation and strategic planning. Together, we prepare to face what's coming. The chamber erupted again, with representatives from multiple species speaking simultaneously. The major powers were clearly struggling with the concept of allying with their most feared enemy, while smaller powers seemed torn between relief at the end of Krillian expansion and terror at what might replace it. Technarch Zeeks managed to make themselves heard above the commotion. What evidence do we have that cooperation with the Krillians would be effective? Their own forces were unable to stand against these entities. Sarah had hoped someone would ask that question. That's where humanity's perspective becomes relevant. The Krillians are apex predators who have built their entire civilization around being the most dangerous force in any encounter. When they face something more dangerous than themselves, they have no alternative strategies. She activated a new section of the display, showing historical data from Earth. Humanity evolved as prey animals who learned to hunt predators. We've spent our entire evolutionary history developing tactics for defeating enemies stronger, faster, and more dangerous than ourselves. We specialize in finding weaknesses that dominant predators never even realize they have. General Vrak leaned forward, his multiple eyes focusing intently on the human representatives. You claim to understand tactics for fighting superior enemies, yet humans are the weakest military force in this council. Exactly, Sarah said with a slight smile. We're weak, so we've had to get creative. The Krillians are strong, so they've never needed to develop unconventional strategies. These entities are apparently stronger than the Krillians, which means they've probably never faced anything that didn't respond to overwhelming force. Alina stepped back to the podium. The Krillians agreed to negotiate with us because we demonstrated something they hadn't encountered before, prey that fights back intelligently. We showed them that weakness can be turned into strength if applied correctly. Counselor Murrath spoke again, her translator carrying undertones of desperate hope. What specific strategies do you propose? That depends on what we're facing, Alina replied. The Krillians have agreed to share their intelligence data about these entities, including sensor recordings from the encounters. Once we understand our enemy's capabilities and limitations, we can begin developing countermeasures. High Counselor Thane rose from his position, his crystalline form casting rainbow patterns across the chamber walls. This proposal requires consideration by each member species. However, Given the urgency of the situation, I suggest we establish a joint commission to review the Krillian intelligence and develop preliminary response strategies. General Vrak's subsonic growl carried clear skepticism. And if this commission determines that alliance with the Krillians is inadvisable, what then? Elena's response was immediate and firm. Then we face these entities alone with whatever military resources we have available. But I would remind the general that our current combined fleets were considered inadequate to face the Krillians themselves. Against something that defeated the Krillians, our chances of success would be minimal. The debate continued for several hours, with representatives raising concerns about everything from the reliability of Krillian intelligence to the possibility that the entire situation was an elaborate trap. But gradually, the weight of logic began to shift opinion toward acceptance. The final vote was closer than Sarah had hoped. 25 species in favor of establishing the Joint Commission, 16 opposed, and 2 abstentions. But it was enough to move forward. As the session concluded, Sarah found herself surrounded by representatives from various species, all asking questions about the proposed cooperation with the Krillians. Most seemed genuinely curious about humanity's perspective on asymmetric warfare, though several appeared to be testing her knowledge to determine if the humans really understood what they were proposing. Dr. Ockafer, who had been observing from the gallery, made his way down to the main floor as representatives began filing out. "Captain, I've been thinking about the biological implications of what the Krillians described." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked. "Entities that can break down matter at the molecular level and absorb it," Dr. Ockafer explained. "That's not just advanced technology, that's a fundamentally different form of existence. If they can manipulate matter that directly, they might not even be biological in any sense we understand." Elena, overhearing the conversation, turned to join them. "What are you suggesting, Doctor?" "I'm suggesting that everything we know about how to fight living enemies might be irrelevant. We could be facing something that exists according to completely different physical laws." The implications were sobering. Sarah had been thinking in terms of asymmetric warfare between different types of biological entities. But if they were facing something that operated on entirely different principles, their tactical assumptions might be completely wrong. "Then we need more information," Sarah said finally. "The Joint Commission will need access to every piece of data the Krillians can provide." 3 days later, the Harmony's Edge received new orders to serve as the primary liaison vessel between the Council and Krillian representatives. Sarah found herself back in the captain's chair, preparing for another journey to the edge of known space, this time accompanied by the Joint Commission's research team. Dr. Ockafer had been appointed as the Commission's chief xenobiologist, while Elena would serve as primary diplomatic contact. The team also included representatives from the major powers' scientific communities, though Sarah noticed that none of the military leaders had volunteered to participate directly. The return journey to Krillian space was tense, with Commission members constantly reviewing what little data they had and developing preliminary theories about what they might encounter. The Valorians proposed that the entities were some form of advanced nanotechnology run amok. The Zeph suggested they might be energy beings that had learned to manipulate matter. The Morvac, characteristically, simply wanted to know how to kill them. When they arrived at the designated coordinates, the Krillian fleet was already waiting. But this time, instead of surrounding the human vessel in a threatening formation, the alien ships maintained a respectful distance while transmitting detailed docking procedures. Sarah found herself aboard a Krillian vessel for the first time, walking through corridors that pulsed with organic rhythms and breathing with their own atmosphere. The ship was alive in every sense, its walls lined with neural networks that transmitted information faster than any electronic system. The meeting chamber was vast, designed to accommodate beings significantly larger than humans. When the Krillian representatives entered, Sarah felt the familiar fear effect wash over her, but this time she was better prepared for it. The primary Krillian speaker was the same individual they had communicated with before, though Sarah now learned its designation, Primary Hunter Zeth Kamor. Its 4 arms moved in complex patterns as it spoke, each gesture apparently adding meaning to its translated words. "Small humans who think like hunters," it began. "We have prepared intelligence data as agreed. Warning given, this knowledge will change your understanding of existence itself." Alina stepped forward. We're prepared to face whatever truth these entities represent. Primary Hunter Zeth Kamor activated a biological display system that projected three-dimensional images directly into the air above them. What Sarah saw made her stomach clench with instinctive revulsion. The entities were unlike anything in known biology. They appeared to be constantly shifting masses of what looked like dark matter, flowing between solid and liquid states without any clear boundaries. But it was their effect on their surroundings that was truly horrifying. Everything they touched simply ceased to exist, not destroyed but unmade, as if it had never been there at all. First contact occurred at Trim Colony Vashtec 9, the Krillian explained. Colony sensors detected unusual gravitational anomalies in system outreaches. Investigation ships sent to examine. The display showed Krillian vessels approaching what looked like empty space, but as they drew closer, the darkness began to move toward them. When it made contact with the ships, they simply vanished, leaving no debris, no energy signatures, nothing to indicate they had ever existed. Entire colony consumed within standard cycles, Zeth Kamor continued. Planet mass reduced to quantum foam. Star itself began showing signs of destabilization. Dr. Akafer leaned forward, his scientific curiosity overriding his fear. Do you have any theories about their composition or energy requirements? The Krillian's multiple eyes focused on him. They appear to consume organized matter and convert it to base energy. Purpose unknown, communication impossible. They do not respond to any known form of signal transmission. How fast do they move? Alina asked. Variable, sometimes slower than standard ships, sometimes instantaneous across vast distances. Pattern suggests they can manipulate space-time directly. Sarah felt her tactical mind working through the implications. You said they're following your expansion path. Are they tracking you specifically, or are they just moving in the same direction? The Krillian paused, its harmonics shifting to what might have been uncertainty. Unknown, but evidence suggests they are herding us toward Galactic core, toward regions of highest population density. The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the implications. The entities weren't just consuming random matter. They were deliberately driving populations toward central areas, possibly for more efficient harvesting. Dr. Akafer asked the question everyone was thinking. How long do we have? Primary Hunter Zeth Kamor's response was immediate and chilling. Based on current advancement trait, entities will reach Council core systems within 4 standard cycles, perhaps fewer if accelerate approach. 4 years, maybe less. The greatest military powers in the galaxy had 4 years to develop a defense against entities that had effortlessly destroyed the most feared warriors in known space. As the meeting continued and more data was shared, Sarah found herself thinking about humanity's history of facing impossible odds. They had always found a way to survive, to adapt, to turn disadvantage into opportunity. But this was different. This wasn't about fighting a superior enemy. This was about fighting something that might not even recognize them as enemies. Something that treated entire civilizations as nothing more than raw material to be processed. The question was whether 4 years would be enough time to develop a miracle, because that's exactly what they were going to need. 18 months into the alliance with the Krillians, the joint research facility orbiting the neutron star had become the most heavily defended location in known space. Ships from every major council species surrounded the station in overlapping defensive formations, while Krillian biovessels moved through their ranks like massive predators swimming among schools of fish. Captain Sarah Chen stood in the facility's main laboratory, watching Dr. Akafer and his expanded research team work frantically on their latest attempt to understand the entities they had designated as devourers. The lab itself was a marvel of interspecies cooperation, combining Valorian crystal computing arrays, Zeph quantum processors, Morvac industrial fabricators, and Krillian bioneural networks into something that shouldn't have been possible. Any progress? Sarah asked as she approached the primary workstation. Dr. Akafer looked up from a 3-dimensional molecular display, his eyes bloodshot from months of minimal sleep. We're making progress understanding what they're not, he said wearily. They're not traditional matter. They're not energy beings. They're not biological in any sense we recognize, but what they actually are. He gestured helplessly at the incomprehensible data streams flowing across the displays. Ambassador Vasquez joined them, carrying a tablet filled with reports from Council intelligence services. "We've got confirmation of 3 more colonies going dark in the past week," she announced grimly. "The Devourers are accelerating their advancement schedule." Sarah studied the tactical display showing the entity's current position. They had consumed nearly a quarter of the galactic rim, leaving nothing behind but empty space where entire star systems once existed. The pattern was becoming clearer with each advance. They were definitely herding populated regions toward the galactic core. "What about the latest proposals from the Defense Committee?" Sarah asked. Elena's expression darkened. "General Vrak is still pushing for a massive fleet engagement at the Meridian Line. He believes concentrated firepower might be able to damage them. Technarch Zeeks wants to try quantum disruption weapons. The Valorians are proposing some kind of crystalline barrier system." Sarah shook her head. "All of those approaches assume the Devourers follow conventional physics. Everything we've learned suggests they don't." "That's the problem," Dr. Akafer said, turning back to his displays. "We're trying to fight something that exists according to rules we don't understand. It's like, imagine trying to explain color to someone who's never had the concept of sight. We're lacking the fundamental framework to even comprehend what we're dealing with." Primary Hunter Zeth Kamor materialized in the laboratory entrance, its massive form causing several human technicians to step back involuntarily. The Krillian had become a regular presence at the research facility, and while the fear effect was still present, most of the team had developed at least partial immunity through repeated exposure. "Small humans and allies," it announced. "New intelligence has arrived from forward observation posts." Sarah turned to face the alien representative. "What kind of intelligence?" "Devourers have altered behavior pattern. Previous advancement was methodical and predictable. Current advancement shows signs of urgency. They are accelerating beyond all previous measurements." Elena stepped forward. "How much acceleration?" "Previous estimates indicated 4 cycles until core system contact. Revised estimates indicate 18 standard months, perhaps fewer." The laboratory fell silent except for the humming of various scientific instruments. 18 months. They had lost more than half their preparation time. Dr. Akafer slammed his hand down on the workstation, startling everyone in the room. "Damn it! We're approaching this all wrong. We keep trying to understand them as if they're just another form of life operating under different physical laws. But what if they're not operating under physical laws at all?" Sarah felt something click in her mind. "What do you mean?" "What if they're not from our universe? What if they're from somewhere else entirely, and they're breaking through into our reality? That would explain why they seem to ignore our physics. They're operating according to completely different rules." Primary Hunter Zeth Kamor's harmonics shifted to what Sarah had learned to recognize as intense interest. "Explain theory further." Dr. Akafer activated a new display showing theoretical models of dimensional physics. "Look at the way they consume matter. They don't break molecular bonds or convert mass to energy. The matter just stops existing. What if they're not consuming it at all? What if they're translating it into their home dimension?" Elena leaned forward. That would mean they might not even be aware of us as intelligent life," Sarah finished, the implications hitting her like a physical blow. "To them, we might just be part of the local matter configuration. They're not conquering or destroying, they're harvesting." The Krillian representative stood motionless for several moments, its multiple eyes processing this new perspective. "If accurate, conventional warfare approaches are meaningless, cannot fight harvesting equipment with weapons designed for biological enemies." Dr. Akafer nodded grimly. "Exactly. It's like trying to negotiate with a mining operation. The machinery doesn't care about the feelings of the ore it's processing." Sarah felt her tactical mind shifting gears, approaching the problem from an entirely new angle. "But machinery can be disrupted. Equipment can malfunction. If they're operating some kind of dimensional harvesting technology, there might be ways to interfere with the process." "How?" Elena asked. "We need to think like engineers instead of soldiers," Sarah said, packing around the laboratory as ideas began forming. "What would disrupt a harvesting operation? Contaminated feedstock, feedback in the processing systems, unexpected resistance from the raw materials." Primary Hunter Zeth Kamor's harmonics took on new overtones. "Elaborate on contaminated feedstock concept." Dr. Akafer was already pulling up new displays, his exhaustion replaced by excited energy. "If they're translating matter from our dimension to theirs, there might be specific types of matter that cause problems in the translation process, elements or compounds that don't convert properly. Like a virus in a computer system, Sarah added. Something that looks like normal data but causes the system to malfunction when it tries to process it. Elena was taking rapid notes on her tablet. What kinds of matter might cause translation problems? Artificial elements for starters, Dr. Ackefer said, his fingers flying over the laboratory's control systems. Synthetic compounds that don't occur naturally, quantum-entangled particles, matter that's been altered at the subatomic level. Primary Hunter Zeth Kamor activated its own biological interface, connecting directly to the laboratory's data networks. Krillian archives contain records of unusual matter interactions during Devourer encounters, previously dismissed as measurement errors. The Krillian's data streams began flowing through the display systems, showing sensor readings from the earliest encounters with the Devourers. Buried in the massive data sets were tiny anomalies, moments when the consumption process seemed to hesitate or stutter. There, Dr. Ackefer pointed to a specific reading. Look at this. The Devourers encountered a Krillian ship carrying experimental bioneural matrices. The consumption process took 3 times longer than normal, and there are signs of processing instability. Sarah studied the data, her mind racing through possibilities. What made those matrices different? Quantum biological hybrid technology, the Krillian explained. Matter that exists partially in multiple dimensional states simultaneously. Elena looked up from her notes. Can we produce similar matter artificially? The Zeph quantum processors might be capable of it, Dr. Ackefer said, and the Valorian crystal arrays could probably stabilize the quantum states, but we'd need massive quantities to have any effect on entities that consume entire star systems. Sarah felt the pieces of a plan beginning to form. What if we don't try to poison their entire operation? What if we just disrupt their processing at critical moments? Explain, Primary Hunter Zeth Kamor requested. They're herding us toward the galactic core, right? That suggests they have a specific harvesting plan. What if we contaminate key systems along their route, force them to slow down or change direction, buy ourselves time to develop better countermeasures? Elena was nodding thoughtfully. Guerrilla warfare, hit-and-run tactics designed to disrupt their operations rather than destroy them outright. Exactly. We can't fight them directly, but we might be able to make ourselves too much trouble to harvest efficiently. Dr. Ackefer was already running calculations on the laboratory's computing systems. It could work. If we can identify which types of matter cause the most processing problems, we could seed key systems with contaminated material. The Devourers would either have to slow down to filter it out, or risk damage to their translation mechanisms. Primary Hunter Zeth Kamor's harmonics shifted to what Sarah recognized as approval. Strategy shows understanding of unconventional warfare. Humans demonstrate why prey species can sometimes defeat superior predators. Over the next several hours, the laboratory became a hive of activity as scientists from multiple species worked together to develop what they were calling dimensional contamination strategies. The Valorians provided crystal matrix technologies capable of existing in multiple quantum states. The Zeph contributed their most advanced particle manipulators. The Morvac offered their expertise in mass production and deployment systems. The Krillians, surprisingly, proved to have the most valuable contribution of all: detailed intelligence about the Devourers' advancement patterns and preferred targets. They consistently target systems with highest organized matter density, Zeth Kamor explained as tactical displays showed the entity's movement patterns. Planets with large populations, industrial centers, areas of concentrated technology. Sarah studied the patterns, noting something the Krillians might have missed. They're not just going for high density. Look at this progression. They're targeting systems in a specific sequence, almost like they're following a predetermined harvesting route. Elena joined her at the tactical display. If their route is predetermined, we can predict where they'll go next. Better than that, Sarah said with growing excitement. We can set traps. Dr. Ackefer looked up from his work on quantum-contaminated matter samples. What kind of traps? Systems loaded with contaminated material, planets seeded with quantum biological hybrids, entire regions designed to cause feedback in their translation process. Primary Hunter Zeth Kamor's multiple eyes focused intently on Sarah. Proposal requires evacuation of target systems. Populations must be relocated before contamination deployment. Sarah nodded. Massive logistical operation, but if it works, we could slow them down enough to develop more permanent countermeasures. Alina was already composing messages on her tablet. I'll contact the Council immediately. This will require coordination from every member species. As the plan took shape, Sarah found herself thinking about humanity's long history of asymmetric warfare. They had always been at their best when facing impossible odds, finding ways to turn weakness into strength and disadvantage into opportunity. But this was different from anything they had faced before. They weren't fighting an enemy that could be defeated. They were trying to become enough of a nuisance to redirect the attention of something vast and incomprehensible. It was, Sarah realized, the ultimate expression of humanity's survival strategy. When you can't win the fight, change the rules of engagement until you can. The question was whether they had enough time to put their plan into action before the Devourers reached the heart of galactic civilization. 18 months to evacuate entire star systems, deploy experimental contamination technologies, and hope that beings from another dimension would find their reality too much trouble to harvest completely. It was impossible, which, given humanity's track record, meant they just might pull it off. The Battle of Meridian Point would be remembered as the moment the galaxy learned the difference between bravery and stupidity. Captain Sarah Chen watched from the bridge of the Asterisk Harmony's edge as the largest fleet in galactic history formed into attack formation, preparing to face an enemy that had already consumed a third of known space. 15 months had passed since the implementation of the contamination strategy, and the results had been mixed. The Devourers had indeed slowed their advance in several key systems, sometimes pausing for weeks as they appeared to filter contaminated matter from their harvesting process. But they had also begun adapting, developing new translation methods that could process even quantum biological hybrid materials. Admiral Torres of the Valorian fleet, Alina's nephew who had risen through the ranks with remarkable speed during the crisis, stood beside her watching the tactical displays. Aunt Alina, the contamination bought us time, but it's not going to stop them. We need a permanent solution. Ambassador Vasquez, now serving as the overall strategic coordinator for the Allied forces, studied the sensor readings showing the Devourers' current position. They were less than 6 months away from the core systems, and their advancement was accelerating again. The contamination strategy was never meant to stop them permanently, she replied. It was meant to give us time to understand them better, and I think we finally do. Dr. Okafor emerged from the ship's expanded laboratory, carrying a data tablet and wearing the expression of someone who had just made a breakthrough that terrified him. Sarah, Alina, you need to see this immediately. Sarah followed him to the lab, where displays showed the results of 15 months of intensive research into devourer behavior and dimensional physics. What she saw made her stomach drop. They're not from another dimension, Dr. Okafor announced without preamble. They're from our dimension, our future. Alina leaned forward. Explain. The quantum signatures we've been detecting, the way they manipulate spacetime, the translation process we thought was moving matter to another dimension. It's all temporal displacement. They're not consuming matter, they're moving it forward in time to when and where they need it. Sarah felt the implications hit her like a physical blow. They're us, from the future. Not exactly us, Dr. Okafor corrected. But they're what our galaxy becomes after they harvest it. They're the end state of their own process, existing in a temporal loop that sustains itself by consuming the past that creates them. Primary hunter Zeth Kamor materialized in the laboratory entrance, its fear-inducing presence somehow less intimidating now that they had learned the truth. Temporal paradox entities, it confirmed. We have suspected this possibility but lacked evidence to confirm. Alina sank into a chair, the weight of the revelation obvious in her posture. That's why conventional weapons don't work. You can't kill something that's already consumed everything you could use to kill it with. And it explains their behavior patterns, Sarah added, her tactical mind working through the implications. They're not just randomly harvesting, they're following a specific timeline. They know exactly which systems to consume and when because they've already lived through this process. Dr. Okafor nodded grimly. Which means our contamination strategy was always temporary. They know how to adapt to it because they've already done it. The laboratory fell silent except for the humming of equipment and the distant vibrations of the massive fleet forming outside. Sarah could see the futility of their situation reflected in everyone's faces. There is, however, one possibility, Dr. Akafer said quietly. What? Elena asked. Temporal paradoxes are notoriously unstable. The devourers exist in a causality loop. They consume the past to create the future that enables them to consume the past. But what happens if we break that loop? Primary hunter Zeth Kamor's harmonics shifted to intense curiosity. Elaborate on paradox-breaking methodology. Dr. Akafer activated a new display showing theoretical models of temporal mechanics. If we could prevent them from consuming the specific matter configurations that create their future existence, the entire loop might collapse. They would cease to exist because the conditions that created them would never come to pass. Sarah studied the complex equations and diagrams. What specific configurations? That's the problem, we don't know. It could be anything. A specific planet, a particular technological development, even individual people whose actions are critical to the timeline. Elena leaned forward. Could it be something they haven't consumed yet, something in the core systems? Possibly. Or it could be something they consumed years ago, and we've already lost the opportunity to prevent their existence. Sarah felt her mind racing through tactical possibilities, but every scenario she could imagine ended the same way. Complete speculation with no way to verify their choices until it was too late. There might be another approach, she said slowly. What if we don't try to prevent their creation? What if we change what they become? Dr. Akafer looked puzzled. How? You said they exist in a causality loop, consuming the past to create their future. But what if we contaminate that loop with something they can't process, something that changes their fundamental nature? Primary hunter Zeth Kamor's multiple eyes focused intently on Sarah. Elaborate on contamination of temporal loop. Sarah moved to the tactical display, her mind working through the implications of her idea. We know they can adapt to our current contamination methods because they've already lived through this timeline. But what if we introduce something that doesn't exist in their timeline? Something genuinely new. Elena caught on immediately. Something that creates a new timeline branch they haven't experienced. Exactly. If we can introduce a sufficient novelty into the temporal loop, we might force it to recalculate. At minimum, we could change what they become. At best, we might prevent them from existing at all. Dr. Akafer was already running calculations on the laboratory computers. It could work in theory, but the novelty would have to be significant enough to alter fundamental aspects of galactic development, and we'd need to introduce it at exactly the right moment in the timeline. When would that be? Elena asked. Now, Sarah said with sudden certainty. They're accelerating their advance because they're approaching the critical moment in their timeline, the point where they secure the matter configurations necessary for their existence, if we can disrupt that process. Primary hunter Zeth Kamor activated its biological interface, connecting to the ship's data networks. Proposal requires unprecedented level of interspecies cooperation. All allied forces must coordinate simultaneous action across multiple star systems. Sarah nodded. Not just military coordination. We need every species to contribute something genuinely unique to the effort, something that doesn't exist in the Devourer's timeline. Elena was already composing messages on her tablet. What kind of contributions? The Valorians' crystal consciousness arrays, the Zeph quantum computing networks, the Morvac industrial fabrication systems, the Krillians' bioneural technology, and humanity's. She paused, realizing what humanity's unique contribution had to be. Humanity's what? Dr. Akafer asked. Our ability to think like prey, Sarah said with a grim smile. Every other species in this alliance has been thinking about how to fight the Devourers, but fighting them is impossible because they've already won in their timeline. We need to think like prey animals who specialize in survival through adaptation and misdirection. Primary hunter Zeth Kamor's harmonics shifted to what Sarah had learned was approval. Humans demonstrate consistent ability to perceive tactical solutions invisible to predator species. Over the next several hours, the laboratory became the center of the most ambitious scientific collaboration in galactic history. Representatives from every allied species worked together to design what Dr. Akafer was calling a temporal disruption cascade, a coordinated introduction of novel elements across multiple star systems, timed to coincide with the Devourer's critical harvesting operations. The Valorians contributed crystalline matrices capable of storing and processing consciousness itself. The Zeph provided quantum computers that could calculate in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The Morvac offered fabrication systems that could transform matter at the molecular level in real time. The Krillians, surprisingly, offered the most critical component, their bioships themselves. "We will sacrifice primary fleet elements to serve as delivery systems," Primary Hunter Zeth Kamor announced. "Bioneural networks will interface directly with temporal disruption systems. Risk of total fleet loss acceptable if strategy succeeds." Elena looked up from her coordination efforts. "That's not necessary. We can find other delivery methods." "Negative. Krillian bioships represent unique element in galactic timeline. Our alliance with prey species creates unprecedented cooperation pattern. Devourers cannot have experienced this configuration in their timeline." Sarah realized the Krillian was right. The alliance itself was the novelty they needed to introduce into the temporal loop. The galaxy's most feared warriors cooperating with species they had always considered prey was something that couldn't exist in any timeline where the Devourers successfully consumed everything. The final plan was staggering in its complexity and audacity. Coordinated strikes across 17 star systems, each introducing a different novel element into the Devourer's harvesting process. Crystal consciousness matrices that could store the memories and personalities of entire populations. Quantum computers that existed in multiple dimensional states simultaneously. Bioneural networks that formed genuine partnerships between different species' consciousness. Most importantly, the plan relied on something that had never existed before in galactic history: perfect cooperation between prey and predator species. When the Devourers reached the Meridian system 3 days later, they found something their timeline had never prepared them for. Instead of the usual organized matter configurations they expected to harvest, they encountered a coordinated response that challenged every assumption built into their temporal loop. The Valorian crystal ships projected consciousness fields that merged the minds of volunteers from every allied species, creating Gestalt intelligences that existed partially outside normal spacetime. The Zeph quantum arrays calculated probability matrices that actively altered local reality, making certain outcomes more or less likely through pure mathematical manipulation. The Morvac industrial vessels began fabricating matter configurations that had never existed before, creating elements with properties that couldn't be predicted from their atomic structure. And the Krillian bioships, their neural networks merged with allied consciousness fields, became something entirely new: predators who protected prey, hunters who chose cooperation over conquest. Sarah watched from the Asterisk Harmony's edge as the battle, if it could be called that, unfolded across multiple dimensions of space and time. The Devourers' advance slowed, then stopped, then began to stutter as their temporal processing systems encountered configurations that didn't exist in their original timeline. "It's working," Dr. Akafer announced, his voice filled with amazed disbelief. "Their causality loop is destabilizing. The temporal paradox is resolving in favor of the new timeline." On the main view screen, the Devourers began to change. The flowing dark matter that had consumed a third of the galaxy started to break apart, revealing structures that looked almost familiar. Ships that bore design elements from every species in the Alliance. Technology that seemed to be a fusion of biological and mechanical systems. "They're not disappearing," Elena observed. "They're transforming." Primary Hunter Zeth Kamor, whose consciousness was now partially merged with the allied Gestalt, spoke with harmonics that carried undertones from dozens of different species. "Temporal loop has been altered rather than broken. Devourers are becoming what they were always meant to be." Sarah watched in amazement as the transformed entities began to reverse their consumption process, restoring matter to spacetime rather than removing it. Entire star systems that had been consumed began to reappear, their populations intact but somehow changed by their experience. "They're giving everything back," she whispered. "Not giving back," the merged consciousness of Primary Hunter Zeth Kamor replied. Completing cycle. They were never destroyers. They were gardeners. Temporal loop prevented them from remembering original purpose. Dr. Ockhaffer was studying the readings with growing excitement. The entities from our future, they weren't trying to destroy the past. They were trying to preserve it. The consumption process was a form of temporal storage, protecting matter and consciousness from some other threat we haven't encountered yet. Elena leaned forward. What threat? The transformed entities began transmitting directly to the allied consciousness fields, sharing information that had been locked away in their temporal loop for eons. Images of something vast and cold moving between galaxies, consuming not just matter but the very concept of existence itself. The true enemy comes from spaces between galaxies, the merged consciousness explained. Entities that consume entire realities. Devourers were created to preserve our timeline until alliance could be formed to resist greater threat. Sarah felt the scope of what they had accomplished hitting her like a revelation. They hadn't just prevented their own destruction. They had completed a temporal loop that had been designed to save not just their galaxy, but potentially every galaxy the true enemy might encounter. The cooperation between species, she said slowly. The alliance between prey and predator, that was what they were trying to preserve. That was the weapon they needed against the real threat. Correct, the transformed entities confirmed. Alliance represents unique solution to universal consumption. Cooperation creates possibilities that individual species cannot achieve. This is why timeline was preserved and guided toward this moment. Elena stood up, her diplomat's mind already working through the implications. They're asking us to help them defend other galaxies. The transformed entities, who Sarah now understood had once been the future evolution of their own alliance, projected star charts showing the approaching true enemy. Vast clouds of absolute nothingness moving between galaxies, consuming everything in their path without even acknowledging the existence of the civilizations they destroyed. How long do we have? Sarah asked. Approximately 1,000 standard years before enemy reaches this galactic cluster. Sufficient time to prepare if alliance holds and expands. Primary hunter Zeth Kamor's individual consciousness separated from the Gestalt long enough to address the human representatives directly. Small humans, who think like hunters? You have demonstrated that prey species can teach predators new forms of strength. Will you continue alliance to face greater challenges? Sarah looked around the laboratory at the representatives of dozens of species working together in ways that would have been impossible just 2 years earlier. The galaxy's most feared warriors had become partners with the species they once terrorized. Prey and predator had found common ground in the face of an unimaginable threat. Of course, she said simply, that's what allies do. Elena smiled and placed her hand on Sarah's shoulder. Besides, we humans have gotten pretty good at facing impossible odds. 1,000 years should be more than enough time to figure out how to defeat entities that consume realities. The transformed entities that had once been devourers began transmitting technical specifications for technologies that existed outside normal time, sharing knowledge that would allow the Alliance to defend not just their own galaxy, but others as well. The temporal loop had been completed, but rather than ending the story, it had revealed that this was only the beginning. As the Asterisk Harmony's Edge prepared to return to Council space with news of their success, Sarah found herself thinking about humanity's journey from the outer rings of the galactic community to the center of an alliance that would soon span multiple realities. They had started as the weakest military force in the Council, dismissed by species that considered them barely worthy of attention. But they had proven that weakness, when combined with intelligence and determination, could become a strength that even the galaxy's apex predators learned to respect. The galaxy's most feared warriors had indeed been left speechless by humanity's approach, not because humans had conquered them with superior force, but because humans had offered them something they had never experienced, the possibility of being more than just predators. And in the end, that simple compliment, treating beings who inspired terror as potential allies rather than inevitable enemies, had saved not just humanity, but the entire structure of reality itself. The universe was vast and filled with threats that defied comprehension. But as Sarah watched the Alliance fleet form up for the journey home, she felt confident that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. After all, the universe had never encountered anything quite like an alliance between humanity's stubborn optimism and the galaxy's most dangerous predators. That combination had already achieved the impossible once. She had a feeling they were just getting started.